You are dismissed with Kelly now, if you want to go. So cool to see Brittany Jackson back with us. Brittany was here last year as a mentor, and she's a student now at Northern Seminary. Pretty good place up around Chicago. So glad you're with us, Brittany. You didn't fail out or anything, did you? Didn't fail out yet. Just kidding. Have you ever heard a story, or maybe in your own life and in your own experience, you've wondered what would have happened if just one detail would have been different in that story? If this would have happened, or if this would have turned out that way, I wonder how it would have all worked out. Have you ever thought that? This morning, we are in the story of Ruth, and we're at a place in the story where it's like that. We're wondering, is it going to work out? Now, we know the story, right? We've heard it before, but this is where we are. If we're reading it for the first time, this is where we are in the story. And as I was preparing this sermon several weeks ago, not long before I had prepared that sermon, Dave Rodriguez and I were having lunch, and David was telling me part of his story. And as he was telling me part of his story, I thought this would be a great story to share as we're kind of living in this tension of Ruth. So I'm going to ask Dave to come now and share with us for just a few minutes as a part of this introduction.
Good morning. For those of you who do not know me, my name is David Rodriguez. It's always a little weird telling people my name. Sometimes they seem confused at first, and they say, well, you don't look Hispanic. Actually, one of the main reasons I came to Ball State was because they offered me a Hispanic Scholar Award. My family would always joke that they'd want their money back as soon as they saw me. But I am, in fact, half Cuban and first or second generation American, depending on your definition. My father was born in Havana, Cuba in 1952. If you're unfamiliar with Cuban history, this was a particularly tumultuous time for the nation, but I'll get to that. My grandfather was also born in Havana and went to the University of Havana at the same time as Fidel Castro, who was learning to be a lawyer. My grandfather studied in the areas of business and finance and used those skills in practice when he was manager at Nestle Company and then finally as a bank branch manager in Santiago. If you don't know where Santiago is, you have Havana up here on the northwest side of the island, and Santiago is down on the southeast side, completely opposite sides of the island, about 12-hour car drive. My grandfather had met my grandmother at the university and settled down in Santiago to start a family. Now, I have to give you a little history of the politics at play in Cuba at this time. In March of 1952, a former president of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, led a military coup against the current president and suspended the elections he had been losing. Not good. Once labeled a progressive president, Batista's second term, after forcibly taking leadership, was very corrupt. He allowed American mafia leaders to operate freely in Cuba so that he could benefit from the prostitution, gambling, and drug trade. He turned Havana into a morally bankrupt playground for America's wealthy and elite. While everyone else was getting poorer and poorer, everybody outside of Havana. Furthermore, he suppressed riots and protests with public tortures and killings. He had set himself up as Cuba's dictator. He's not a good guy. Fidel Castro was a young lawyer at the time and tried to end Batista's tyranny through the legal system. When that failed, he started raising a rebellion and eventually launched an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago in the early morning on July 26, 1953, my father's first birthday. My grandfather recounted the event to me as saying that he could hear the gunshots when the attack was happening, and when it was over, they found a bullet hole in my father's bedroom, but he was unharmed. The rebellion's attack in Santiago was unsuccessful, and a whole bunch of people were executed and put into prison and all that. Fidel Castro got 15 years in prison, but public pressure got him out early. With Che Guevara's help, he finally ousted Batista in 1959. But my grandfather knew that they were just trading dictatorships, one for another. Aware of the tyranny of communism, he used his position as the bank branch manager to pull money from Havana to Santiago. So he was limiting the government's resources by pulling all the money in Santiago. Under the new regime's laws, this was a penalty punishable by death. This was treachery. In 1961, 2 years after that, new laws outlawing private property came into effect. These were laws, specifically at this time, that were outlawing churches and the Roman Catholic Church and turning Cuba into a fully atheist state. So my grandfather decided that they could no longer stay in Cuba and set out to defect with his family. At this time, defections aren't allowed anymore, but at this time they were still allowed. But there was still one large problem. My grandfather was a wanted man. He had been taking money from Havana and bringing it to Santiago so that the government couldn't use it. So if he tried to leave the country, he'd be certainly checked and found. But providentially, Hispanics have a very confusing naming system. My last name, Rodriguez, is one of the most common names in the world, let alone Cuba. In addition, children also get their mother's surname as a middle name and sometimes go by that instead of their father's surname. So it can get a little confusing, and my grandfather used that to his advantage. When he was signing those money orders in Santiago, he used his mother's surname, which was Pastor. His full name was Joaquin Rodriguez Pastor, and he used that name to sign the money orders. But when he was leaving Cuba with his family, he used the name Rodriguez, so he was able to get through. But leaving was not an easy task. It was a huge risk. They could only bring with them what they could carry. My grandfather recounted how my dad cried when he forgot his baseball mitt. When they were allowed to leave, they were forbidden to ever come back. Their life in the U.S. was not easy, far less than what they were accustomed to in Cuba. But God brought my dad to my mom in New Jersey, and that's how I eventually came into the world. It's easy to think that if one thing went another way, things would be totally different. If the rebellion never happened, if the bullet had hit my dad, if my grandfather had been caught, I wouldn't exist. But that's not the way things happened, and I do exist, and that lets me know that I must have a purpose in God's plan. I can see my story and Boaz and Ruth's story, and I'm sure you all have stories of your own that share similarities. It gives me hope to be able to see their role in the big picture, even if I can't see parts of mine. And I hope it does the same for you. Thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Dave, for sharing. Isn't that a great story? Helps us get to know Dave a little bit more. And this is kind of how the story of Ruth is. It's kind of like one of those things that people are moving around, things are happening, and we're not sure how it's all going to work out. But when we hear stories like Dave's and like the story of Ruth, many times there's parts of the story where the tension builds and we're not sure what's going to happen next. And this is where we are in our study of Ruth this morning. Now I want to take just a few minutes this morning and kind of recap the story. There may be some of you here this morning who aren't real familiar with the story of Ruth, or maybe you've heard it a long time ago and you haven't been here the last few weeks. Let's kind of talk about where we've been. We started this study on October the 6th, and we've been walking through the story of Ruth. And you might remember I said on that first Sunday that the story is really just as much about Naomi as it is Ruth. And some scholars believe that the book should be called Naomi because the story begins with Naomi and it ends with Naomi. So we have Naomi with her husband Elimelech living in this place called Bethlehem. A famine hits the land, and so they leave in order to find food, and they relocate to this place called Moab. Now, while they are in Moab, things get really bad for Naomi. First of all, her husband dies. And then, not only does her husband die, now she is a single mom with 2 boys. They grow up, they marry Moabite women, which you could build a case that was probably not ideal for an Israelite family. Needless to say, not only do they marry Moabite women, but their wives, or the Moabite women, are barren. They're unable to produce children, which would have been seen as a curse in that society. It would have been really bad. Naomi seems to be cursed by God in every way. And then matters turn from bad to worse. Then her 2 sons also die. So here we have these 3 women. We've got Naomi, we've got Orpah, we've got Ruth. 3 women living in a culture where women are unable to make a living on their own. Again, a male-dominated society where women need men in order to survive. And here we have 3 women. I mean, they're on the brink of poverty, of starvation. They're not sure how they're going to make a living. Well, Naomi receives word that conditions have improved in Bethlehem, so she travels back to Bethlehem. She has her 2 daughter-in-laws with her. And somewhere along the way, on the road, she realizes that life is not going to be good for these 2 young women, 2 Moabite women in Bethlehem. So she tells them, she urges them to go back to their homeland. She said, maybe you can find a husband back there, but life will be a dead end for you if you go with me. And you remember the story. Orpah decides to return, but Ruth clings to Naomi. She gives her very life to Naomi and says, I am with you whether I die or whether I live. I'm with you, and your God will be my God. And so she goes with Naomi back to Bethlehem. Now, when they get there, you remember the story? Ruth begins gleaning in a field, and this was the welfare system of the day. This is what widows would have done in order to survive. And she ends up in this field, no ordinary field. It is the field of this guy named Boaz. And Boaz is very kind to Ruth. We learn also that Boaz is a relative of Elimelech. And he's giving her not only a privileged position in the gleaning process, but also kind of giving her gifts of grain. And so he's very, very kind to her. Now, Naomi is still concerned about Ruth's welfare, so she devises a plan to have Ruth present herself to Boaz. This is where we were last week, hoping that he will take her and marry her. And we know Ruth goes in. She risks it all. She even asks Boaz to be her kinsman-redeemer, to redeem her and Naomi. And so now we are in the tension of this story. How's it going to work out? What's going to happen? Is Boaz going to marry Ruth? And we then find out that there is someone in closer relationship to Naomi and Ruth other than Boaz. And our heart kind of drops and we go, oh no, what's going to happen here? So Boaz is going to settle this thing. Now, if you're reading the story, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of cheering for Ruth and Boaz at this point, right? Kind of hoping they're going to get together. But this other guy, what's going to happen if Ruth marries him? Is he going to be as kind to Ruth as Boaz? What's God up to here? And this is where we are in chapter 4. Heather Headley's going to come now and read Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. And let me invite you to turn in your Bibles to Ruth chapter 4. And then when Heather is done, leave your Bible open because we're going to continue to walk through this story together this morning. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 12.
Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman-redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman-redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of the seated here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this the kinsman-redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman-redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses Then the elders and all those at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by the young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah."
All right. Thank you, Heather. Now, if you're looking at the text this morning, notice the first word in the text. Meanwhile. Meanwhile. Now, we got to remember where we were in chapter 3. Do you remember where we were last week? Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." So we got Ruth and Naomi waiting. They have no control. They're not in this part of the story, okay? They're just sitting at home waiting for Boaz to do what Boaz said he will do. Now, Boaz had told them, "I'm not going to rest until the matter is settled." But many times we find ourselves in this place, don't we? In this meanwhile place. Meanwhile, what's God going to do? How is this going to work out? We really can't see how it's all going to work out at this point. And there's this tension in the situation. And this is where we are in the story today. I think the author of Ruth wants us to live in the meanwhile sometimes. You know that? Sometimes you and I are in the meanwhile, aren't we? We're just meanwhile. While it's working out. While we're just sitting at home waiting for God to move. This is what's going on. We have Naomi and Ruth at home. They're confident Boaz is going to do what he said he's going to do, but they're not sure how it's all going to work out yet. And we have Boaz going to the city gate. Now, where is this? What is this city gate, and what is so significant about the city gate? Now, what you need to know is in ancient culture, the city gate is the place where business transactions took place. It's really where government business took place. Now, sometimes you see prophets at the city gate proclaiming prophetic messages, so it's kind of the hub of the city. And this is where Boaz is going to conduct legal business. Now, as in many courtrooms in our culture today, the public places, right? You can go in, you can watch what's going on. This is what's happening here at the city gate. Now, I have to wonder how long it took Boaz to find this guy, at the city gate. But he goes there, maybe perhaps even early in the morning to watch people come in and out of the city. But he goes there and he finds this anonymous relative. Scholars actually call him Mr. No Name because he doesn't have a name. So we'll just call him Mr. No Name today. How about we do that? So Ruth chapter 1, when the kinsman-redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and he sat down. So Boaz has him, but you have to know, in order to conduct legal business, in order for this deal to be legal, you also have to have 10 elders of the city. So Boaz rounds up these 10 elders, and he tells them, "You guys sit down, okay? We're going to conduct business here." And then Boaz brings up the situation. Look at verse 3. Then he said to the kinsman-redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech." Now, this might catch us a bit off guard here because we're following the story. We're thinking of Ruth and Boaz. We're thinking of them getting married, and that's kind of all that's in our minds at this point, right? And so we kind of picture Boaz going to ask permission to marry Ruth, but he doesn't even bring Ruth up at this point, does he? He's talking about land here. Now, hang on, because Boaz knows what he's doing here, and we got to keep following him along here. Let's talk about the dynamics here for just a moment, though. Bethlehem has been in a famine, okay? Now, you could imagine, during a famine, everybody's just trying to get by, aren't they? Naomi and Elimelech left town, right? And maybe others left town during this time. What happened to their land when they left town? Probably it just sat there, didn't it? It just sat empty. And so when Naomi comes back into town, there's her land, okay? Now, let's also talk about the legal situation here. We need to understand this if we're going to understand the context of what is going on here. Now, remember, this is a culture dominated by men. In fact, women have no rights. Women cannot inherit, nor can they take care of land. So what would happen most of the time is that the closest relative would be required to marry the widow. This would usually be the deceased man's brother, okay? And so that person would then become the landowner, okay? Now, it's interesting to note also that any children that would be conceived by the relative and the widow would be considered the deceased man's children, okay? So the relative redeems the land, and which remains in the estate of the deceased man. So if the widow then is unable to have children, particularly a son, the land will then go back to the one who redeemed it, the kinsman-redeemer. But if a child is conceived, and if that child is a son, then that child will inherit the land. Are you tracking with me here? Am I too far out there? Again, the famine has devastated the community. People have not been able to take care of their own land, much less the land of near relatives. So in many ways, this matter of the land that Naomi is probably living on at this point has been unsettled. But Naomi is back in town now, and Boaz is pressing the issue. Now, notice here that Boaz says the land belongs to who? Naomi. Naomi has come back and is selling the piece of land that belonged to Elimelech. Now, wait a minute here. Naomi is selling the land? Think about that for a minute here. Some scholars suggest that Boaz is even bending the rules a little bit here. That Boaz is saying Naomi is selling this land when all of it, really Naomi doesn't have any right to sell the land. Naomi's a woman. She can't own the land. How is she selling the land? Well, scholars say that what Boaz is doing here, he's setting the situation up where Naomi and Ruth will be cared for. You see? They're selling the land. In other words, sometimes kinsman redeemers would come in and take the land because it was theirs, and rightfully so, and then they would not care for the widow. And the widow would sometimes even be evicted from her land. And so sometimes this happened in a corrupt way, and Boaz is making sure this is not going to happen. So he says Naomi is selling the land. Now, the law would have simply required, the law would have just allowed for the nearest relative to simply claim the land. But again, Boaz is saying he's selling the land. And notice too that no one questions his statement here. No one questions him. So here's the deal. An old widow is living on her husband's land, and Mr. No-Name, if he buys the land, he's going to have to put money into it. Okay, he's going to have to care for Naomi and for Ruth. And here's the deal. If Naomi is not able to have a child, which she is beyond childbearing years, right? Then what's going to happen? Eventually, the kinsman-redeemer will then inherit that land back into his estate. So, he would then put money into the land now, but Naomi's not going to have a child, right? And so, eventually, he'll get the land back to himself. Boaz explains in verse 4, I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. Again, that you buy it. Isn't that interesting? That language that he uses there. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. Now, Mr. No-Name quickly responds. What does he say in verse 4? I'm in. I'll redeem it. Sounds like a good deal to me, right? I can put a little bit of money into the land right now. Naomi's not going to have any more kids, and eventually this land will go back into my estate, thereby increasing my estate for my children. This is probably what this guy's thinking. And you and I are reading the story, and we're heart sinking, right? We're going, oh man, I wanted Boaz and Ruth to get together. Boaz was so kind to her. He would really take good care of Naomi and Ruth. But what about this guy? I'm not sure what he's going to do, even if he will take care of her. And so we keep reading here. It seems like at this point, the other man, Mr. No-Name, is going to do the deal. But hang on, the story is not over yet. Now, up until this point, do you notice that Ruth's name is not mentioned, okay? He's simply talking about land. But all of a sudden, Boaz brings her up. Look at verse 5 there. Then Boaz said, on the day that you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Now, this is where the story begins to turn, isn't it? I don't know how many of you remember a few years ago when we had the Unity Revival over at Union Baptist Church, and I preached this text. Do you remember that? And I really kind of came down on this place that said the reason this guy didn't want to marry Ruth is because she was a Moabitess, okay? It was racism, I said that night. And I think on some level it may have been that. But as I've been studying the story in these recent months, I'm getting another angle here. I think it may have been racism. He may not have wanted to take in this foreigner into his family, but there's also economic reasons here. Do you see what we're saying here? There's also an economic reason why he would not have wanted Ruth. Because Ruth is young, isn't she? Ruth is able to bear a child. And if she bears a child, guess what? This guy's losing the land, because the land is going to go to that child if that happens. Now, again, maybe it was racism. Maybe it was because she was a foreigner. Maybe it was because of economic reasons. But for whatever reason, as soon as he mentions Ruth's name, this guy starts to backtrack faster. You can have it. I don't want it anymore, right? I didn't sign anything, did I? You know, he's trying to get out of this deal as fast as he can. Look at this. At this, the kinsman-redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. Do you see that there? And I think that's probably where the economic reasons come in there, because he's saying, look, I don't have that much. And if I invest in this land, it's probably not going to pay off. So I can't do it. You do it, Boaz. I'm out. You can have it. How many of us are secretly cheering at this point if we're reading the story for the first time, right? Yes, we're glad he's bowing out here. We continue to read. Now, in earlier times, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions. So, we're getting some insight into how legal transactions worked, right? Now, today you have a lot of paperwork if you're going to buy a house, right? But then you just took your sandal off and you just did it. We kind of wish we could go back to that. It would be a lot simpler, right? But we see what's going on here. Let's see, I lost my place here. Don't you wish you could go back to that? Look what he says here. So the kinsman-redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. Again, Boaz is claiming that he's going to take care of this. I am in this deal legally, Boaz says. Verse 9, Boaz announced to the elders, today you have witnessed that I have bought the property from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. Look what he says here. I'm buying the land from Naomi. Again, I think he's bending the rules a little bit here because Naomi can't own the land. But what he's saying here is, look, I'm taking care of this deal. I'm going to put money into it. I'm going to care for Naomi. I'm going to care for Ruth. And if children come out of this union, guess what? They are Elimelech's children. They are Naomi's children. And I'm kind of spoiling the story here a little bit, but when we get to the end, just read on to the end of the chapter here. When the baby is born, they say Naomi has had a son. And go, I thought Ruth had the son. No, it's Naomi's son in legal terms, you see. Many would have thought that even Naomi would have raised the child. It would have been considered her son. So what's Boaz doing here? Boaz is giving up himself, isn't he? Boaz is investing in something that perhaps there will be no return for him. You see, he's doing it though out of love for Ruth and Naomi. And this is what we have to see here. As Ruth left her homeland, we talked about this several weeks ago, and she goes with Naomi to Bethlehem, all prospects of her getting married seem to be gone, right? But she's going anyways. She says, I'll die with you, Naomi. I'll be with you. I'll give up it all to be with you, Naomi, and to lay my life down for you and your God. And here we have Boaz in the same sort of posture here, isn't he? Boaz isn't interested in what he's going to get out of this deal. Boaz isn't concerned about gain. He is giving up. He's laying himself down. He's laying his finances down in order for Naomi and Ruth to be cared for. Again, this posture of serving, it's central to the story here. Now, many times we read the story of Ruth and it becomes a romantic novel, you know? I mean, we think of it in terms of romance. We picture Boaz as this robust Disney character, you know, with the big muscles, and Ruth as the damsel in distress. Now, maybe Ruth was beautiful, and maybe Boaz was handsome, but that's not the point of the story. The story is about Ruth and Boaz giving up, selfless giving for the other. Allow me to share with you this quote from Custis James' book, and this is the book I recommended early on here. I just want to read this to you because I think she says this so wonderful here. If we buy into that explanation, just the explanation that it's a romance story, okay, we do it a terrible disservice to Boaz as well as to Ruth. And we lose the power of the gospel that this narrative so richly conveys. The story becomes about what Ruth and Boaz are getting instead of what they are giving up. Are you with me here? If we picture this like a Disney movie, and all the Disney movies always end with them riding off into the sunset, right? We think, oh, well, Boaz got the pretty girl, right? We think Ruth got the handsome man, right? And it all ended up well for them. And we focus on what Ruth and Boaz are getting here. And what the author of Ruth wants us to see here is it's not like that. It's not about that. Ruth is giving it all up. Boaz is giving it up. And they even understand that if they have a child, that child will not even be their child. Isn't that crazy? Let's continue with the text. We read the blessing of the elders here in verses 11 and 12. The elders say, we are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah. And just you can keep reading there. May he be famous in Bethlehem through his offspring. May they be like Perez and Tamar, which Perez here is Tamar's son, who in Bethlehem narrative or in Bethlehem history, he's kind of considered the father of the city, okay? So what they're saying here is, may your child be famous like our city father. That's kind of what they're saying there. They're praying for blessing. They're praying for a child. They're praying that the child that Ruth and Boaz would produce would be famous. They had no idea, did they, how their prayers were going to be answered. Next week we're going to see Ruth is going to give birth to a son, which is a miracle in and of itself, right? Because she was barren. Now, we understand in today's, by today's science measures that Ruth's barrenness may not have been her, right? It may have been her husband. But for all they know in their world is that Ruth can't have kids, right? So for her to have a son is a miracle in and of itself. But let's take a few minutes this morning and let's talk about not only the story. I mean, it's nice to read a story, isn't it? To hear the story, to be entertained by the story. But it's another thing to figure out, how does this apply to us in our life today? Again, we picked up the story not knowing what was going to happen, kind of living in the tension of the story. And it looked like things weren't going to work out for Boaz and Ruth, but God had a plan, didn't He? God was going to work things out. Ultimately, we see in this story Boaz as the Redeemer. Boaz as the one who rescues Naomi and Ruth. Boaz as the one who gives up his own resources, his own self, for the sake of someone else, for Elimelech's family. We got to understand what he's doing as a selfless sacrifice. Isn't it interesting, as Doug said last week, how we see the gospel in Ruth? The gospel of God in Ruth. You see, and this is what we're understanding. Now remember, Jesus is a descendant of Ruth and Boaz. Jesus comes from this union between Boaz and Ruth. So Ruth's descendant, Boaz's descendant, is another one, isn't he, who lives with a selfless posture. Her descendant is going to be one who gives up, not in order to gain, but who gives up for the sake of the other. As we read this text this morning, you and I are challenged, aren't we, to live in the same sort of posture. Not only did Ruth and Boaz give up, not only were they not interested in what they were going to get out of the deal, but they simply gave because they gave. But we also know that from this union, Jesus comes. Jesus comes into our world, and he lived a selfless life, didn't he? He lived a life that was about giving up for the other. In a few minutes, we're going to come to this table this morning. What an appropriate text to consider as we consider Jesus' body broken for us, his blood shed for us. So this morning, allow me to challenge each one of us as we are under this word this morning, as we submit ourselves to God's word, to not simply look at it as a nice story, but to say this is really what God is calling us to be, isn't it? God is calling us to live like Boaz. God is calling us to live like Ruth. God is calling us to lay down our own agenda, our own plans, our own self for the other. This morning, as God would call you, and as we stand and sing a great song, Matt and Heather are going to come now, Sweetly Broken. As we consider this, and the whole band is going to come, as we consider this morning, may we consider what it means to be broken for one another. And then we're going to come to the table in just a few minutes. If there's a way that you want to respond this morning, if you'd like to come and pray, if you'd like to join the church, now would be the time you do that. Let's all stand together.